Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University, Belfast. This is LawPod.
Welcome to a new episode of LawPod. Today's episode is an anniversary celebration and reflection for the 25th anniversary of the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Queen's University, Belfast. We are marking this important anniversary with a slight delay due to the pandemic. Today, we are joined by four of the previous directors of the Institute, Professor John Jackson, who is Professor of Comparative Criminal Law and Procedure at the University of Nottingham, Professor Kieran McAvoy, who's a professor of Transitional Justice and Law at the Queen's University Belfast School of Law, Professor Shad Maruna, who's Professor of Criminology in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University Belfast, and Professor Graham Illison, who's a Professor of Law and Criminology within the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast. We'll start our conversation on the history and the activities of the ICCJ. We'll start with Professor John Jackson and Professor Kieran McAvoy, who have been around since the early days of the Institute and can start talking a little bit about the establishment of the Institute in 1995, and then we'll proceed with our conversation.
Thanks. Yes, the Institute my involvement with it formally, I suppose, began when I became the first director in terms of the Institute in the law school. But it had, of course, as you said, Alessandro, been started already within Queen's back in 1995 before it came into the law school. And I guess it might be worth just saying how, from my own recollection, the sort of things that maybe brought it into being. And I suppose my own feeling is that maybe the origins of this goes back maybe to the early 90s when there was a bit of a shift in terms of discourse in the criminal justice, criminology world, such as it was at that time. Because, you know, at the early 90s, there was a period, I think, when there was a kind of reduction in violence generally. This is, again, my own perceptions. I don't think this has actually been documented, but there was a kind of space there because of sort of reductions in violence and sort of talks about possible deals and a ceasefire and so on, which of course took place in the middle of the 1990s, about really giving space to the criminal justice organizations, the voluntary organizations, statutory and so on, to maybe develop other dialogues and things not just centered in the violence that had been going on. And people, I think, were a little bit more prepared to get out of their bunkers, maybe talk about things. My own feeling was that, this was kind of initiated somewhat by some, fairly high level civil servants in the Northern Ireland office who kind of brought with them a little bit of experience from the Home Office, where similar things were kind of going on a little bit in England and Wales, a bit more dialogue between organizations. And I think maybe that coincided also with a sort of feeling amongst these civil servants that, we need to engage the academic community more. That hadn't really happened at all. And so it was actually my own sort of feeling at the whole beginning of this was, I remember a phone call sitting in my office in Queens, back in the early 1990s. I got this phone call saying from some secretary in the Northern Ireland office saying that like somebody quite high level would like to speak to me and, believe it or not, invite me to lunch, which now I'd never been approached before by anybody in government, let alone being invited to a lunch. But in a sense, I went along, obviously accepted, and I came face to face with this sort of quite sort of posh English accent civil servant type who'd talked about the need, to involve academics more in the criminal justice and criminology world. And I'm sure I wasn't the only one. I mean, I think they were going round various people sort of at that time, sort of trying to engage them all. And the result of it was, that they started to invite me and others to sort of conferences where I got in touch, more on a more formal basis with criminal justice people. We had judges even sort of coming along for the first time, the opportunity, in fact, to even meet judges outside the security bunker became somewhat a new idea. And I think, there then developed the idea, I suppose, that there should then be a more formal setting for academics, a center for criminology and criminal justice to develop research in the context of a sort of developing, very slow emerging at that time, peace process. And that's sort of my feeling, maybe how it all began. Then, money was put together, and it started. As I said, there was this institute that began in Queens. It was an opportunity, for a sort of bunch of people to get together in a more formal way, in a cohesive manner, with a sort of interdisciplinary focus to look at policymaking in the context, as I say, of this emerging peace process that was very early at that time.
Yeah, I mean, so Kieran McAvoy here. John's recollection is correct. So, I think what happened was the NIO actually commissioned Professor Ken Pease to do a piece of research to look at the viability, to look what was being done around criminological research, and to look at what was needed. I think there was broad consensus. I was working in the voluntary sector at the time. I was working for NIACRO, the Northern Ireland Association for the Care and Resettlement of Offenders. And so we were a big voluntary organisation, and we were part of those conversations basically around, and there was a general consensus, as you say, John, that there was a need for some kind of a dedicated centre. And so in 95, in 94, I think Mike Brogden, the first director, was appointed. He was appointed on a permanent contract as a professor of criminology. And then three others of us, myself, Dave O'Mahony, who was a youth justice specialist previously in the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge, and Keith Bryant, who's an Australian former police officer and then had gone on to become a criminologist. So you had policing, youth justice, myself focused on prisons, and Mike focused on policing. And that was the origins. We were based in a little place that looked like a kind of Hansel and Gretel house. I don't know if you remember it, John, but
Yeah.
it sort of had a melting ice cream kind of vibe on the outside of it, up in Lennoxville. And we were across the road from the Institute of Professional Legal Studies, and we were just down the road from the Vice Chancellor's house. So we kind of thought this was my first academic job. And we thought must be quite important, really, if the Vice Chancellor lives on this street and they train lawyers across the road. And it was a very, very exciting venture. We had, because of the buy-in from the criminal justice agencies, we had senior representatives of the criminal justice system on the board. And so, you would have a senior police officer, someone senior from the DPP, actually the director of public prosecutions, someone senior from the Northern Ireland office, people from the criminal justice voluntary sector. And it was all chaired by Professor Mary McAleese, who went on, of course, to become president of Ireland. So it was a very exciting venture. We were doing something new. And as John says, it was all emerging in the same context as the peace process. So the IRA ceasefire and loyalist ceasefires are in 1994. We are set up, we're up and running by the following July 95. And all of a sudden, criminal justice is at the center of the negotiations and the evolution of the peace process. And so I'm working on issues around prisoner release, which are very high profile. Mike Brogden is working on issues of police reform, which is central to this. John, yourself, and other colleagues ultimately become members of the Criminal Justice Review, which is established under the Good Friday Agreement to review the criminal justice system as a whole. And so there's a vibe, certainly, that there is a place and a space within all of this for criminological expertise, objective academic analysis on hugely controversial issues. Police reform was hugely controversial. Issues around releasing politically motivated prisoners, hugely controversial. All of the work that John, your colleagues, and you were involved in around making our criminal justice system fit for purpose in terms of moving out of a conflict, moving out of a war, in effect, to a normal criminal justice system. A huge amount of work. But there was certainly, I think all of us felt very morally energized by the opportunity, I suppose, to use your professional skills as a criminologist. I remember as well, at the same time, around 96, 97, Professor Harry Micah, a very distinguished restorative justice specialist, he takes up a place here as a visiting scholar. And then myself and him and others begin a dialogue with the Republican movement around trying to find an alternative to punishment violence. That dialogue ultimately evolves into what are now known as community-based restorative justice schemes here, staffed and run by ex-combatants on both loyalist and Republican side. So you can see here where it, for me, as I suppose I was 27, this was a dream job for me. I was quite a political person, I suppose. I was very excited by criminology, and all of a sudden you're dropped into the middle of an evolving peace process where where criminological skills matter, where these issues are front and center of the politics of the transition. So for me, John, it was just a dream job. I was super, super excited.
Yeah. No, I think I think it was very exciting. I suppose the question was, how did the law school, in a sense, become involved? Because as Kieran was saying, my memories of the institute were rather distant in terms of within Queens. They were situated about as far away as you could go, maybe in terms of walking in the campus near the Vice Chancellor's Lodge, as Kieran said. We were sort of in University Square, quite a long way away. Mike Brogdon did invite us once or twice to sort of come round, and I must admit I was quite overwhelmed sometimes by the lavishness of the what I could see, the building and the offices and so on. And I sort of thought, there's nothing like that we have here down in University Square. But at any rate, it did come to pass that that sort of era, I suppose, of the institute, the early years, sort of came to an end, and there was a sort of university review as to where the institute should go. I mean, there was great work emerging from the institute, but there was probably a feeling that there was a need to engage more formally with the other university schools. So, as I say, I suppose criminology sometimes is talked about, I know, as a sort of rendezvous discipline, and there's all sorts of schools that could bid for it. But somehow in the law school, I think there was a feeling, certainly among some of us, who were kind of trying to create a research culture generally within the school. Things like what's now known as the RAE. Was we're coming home. I was at that time sort of head of the law school, and I was like, wanted to make sure that people, were developing a research culture. And it seemed to me the sort of things, that the work that Kieran was doing and others in the institute were exactly the kind of things that a law school should be sort of engaging with, sort of serious research in the context of the peace process. So, I mean, other schools, I think, perhaps express an interest, but we in law, after discussing it, and there were some debates, have to be said, within the school. Not all were necessarily of the view that this was a good idea, but a kind of consensus emerged. I was head of school. I had a certain influence, perhaps, and I thought it was a good idea. And I have to say there was money a bit behind it as well, because we're looking for research funding, and we had very poor record of that in the law school at that time. So we sort of bid, in a sense, for Kieran and his colleagues to come into our much less lavish accommodation down University Square, and that's how it kind of began in within the law school at any rate. And I suppose I became at the same time director, but I was kind of aware that in a way that there was a sensitivity about it, because I hadn't not really been involved in any of this work, particularly myself and my own research agenda in terms of the specifics of the peace process. And yet those are the things that were going on within the institute. So we had to be careful not perhaps to tread on toes. And Mike was the director at the time of the institute when it was established. But things had to, in a sense, move on, I suppose, with a new era in the institute coming into another school within the university.
I have some good stories on that, but I think Graham, you're looking to come in there, I think, on that, are you?
Yeah, it's just in relation to what you and John were saying there. I think I remember reading somewhere, or maybe I did it for a brochure or something, that when the Institute was established in 95, I think it was obviously the first establishment on the island of Ireland to deal specifically with criminology. So in that sense, it was actually quite far-sighted. But I think at the time it was only one of 6, if memory serves me right, in all of the UK to actually teach graduate level criminology. So in that sense, like compared to what the situation is now, it was well ahead of the curve. But I was thinking as well, you're talking, Kieran, there about funny stories, but I seem to remember long before I started at Queen's that I think Mike had written a report on informal policing or community policing. And I think this was just before the Patent Commission was appointed or whatever. And I think he presented this at a conference in West Belfast. I don't know if you remember that. No,
I do, yeah.
But it got into the media, and the media were sort of lambasting Mike for wanting paramilitaries to be involved in policing, which is not at all what he was saying. But were there any other sort of controversial issues in the early days around the topic of criminology?
I mean, there certainly were. Like I remember, so in one of the things we obviously wanted to do with establishing a new institute was to establish our credibility within the broader UK and international criminological world. And so what we had done was we pitched to host the British Criminology Conference in 1997, which I think, Shad, you may have attended. I'm not sure, but anyway, it was. So this is it's the big UK conference, and so we bid to run it. Now this was at the stage where there was a marching standoff every summer around Drumcree protests, where the Orange Order and other loyal orders were seeking to march through nationalist areas. There was a particular flashpoint in Portadown, in Drumcree, but it happened in other areas, and one of the other flashpoints was also in the Lower Ormo, which is 300 yards from Queen's University here. And so anyway, I remember you had a lot of TV images of riots, of shootings, of firebombings, a whole range of things were happening. And so we had successfully got the National Executive of the British Society of Criminology to let the conference come here. And so I felt a bit like the mayor in Jaws, because as you're coming up to July, the conference is always held in July, flashpoint of the marching season. And so basically you would have had the then president of the BSC, he was quite a conservative guy, saying, "Is everything okay in Belfast?" And Belfast was a shit show. So I was going, everything is totally fine. We have 400 criminologists coming here. And so the theme of the conference was criminology and conflict resolution, right? So what is the role of this, issues of policing, prisons, and so forth in the process of conflict resolution? And so we had, I think 450 criminologists from around the world at the conference. A lot of people remember this conference because of the broader political context. But I remember I had written the speech for the then Lord Mayor of Belfast, who shall remain nameless. But he was quite a conservative DUP councillor and had become Lord Mayor. And so I had written the speech, and it was basically a very progressive speech. Of course, it was saying about, this is a year before the Good Friday Agreement was agreed, and let's not forget the DUP were outside those negotiations because Sinn Féin were involved in them, and so forth, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I had written this speech for the Lord Mayor, assuming, of course, that he's going to change the text. So anyway, my speech says, well, it's clear that criminal justice and criminology is at the center of the emerging peace process. We have to have reform of the police. There has to be consideration of politically motivated prisoners being released. Human rights has to be at the center of the new criminal justice system. And I had written this, and he stood up and he read it. And I was sitting beside some English criminologists who I knew at the dinner in Belfast City Hall, and I'd said to them, "Listen, this guy's really reactionary politician, so anyway, the Lord Mayor stands up and makes this very progressive speech, and they're all looking at me going, "I think you must be a bigot or something. That guy's talking complete sense. That you wouldn't have faulted a word of that if you'd written it yourself." Of course, I had, but he just read it out word for word without changing a decimal of it. So that was the context in terms of the move down. Graham's right. Mike was highly. Basically, Mike was a very, very gifted criminologist, brilliant policing scholar, really brilliant on the history of policing. His scholarship to this day, I would still revisit. But he was an extremely eccentric man, and certainly was not the person you wanted to be running an institute. And I think Queen's probably realised that. I think those kind of incidents where he would have made a few missteps in what was a very sensitive political arena as well. The one that you remember, and there were others, Graham. But what happens then is, and Queen's realised, okay, number one, we have this institute, which is a good idea. So it's still a good idea. We just have a rather eccentric director. And so what we need to do is to get criminology into a bigger school where it'll be more sensible. And of course, John Jackson's a very eminently distinguished scholar and a very sensible person. And so law is the sensible place to pitch it. But then I don't know if you remember this, John. But so Mike is not very happy, basically, about the merger. So what happens then is the rest of us move down to the law school from our little Hansel and Gretel cottage. And Mike stays on for a while. And there's a period where we have a continuity institute. There's been a split, basically, mirroring, in fact, splits that had happened within the broader peace process. And Mike stays on in Hansel and Gretel College. And so for a while, I think there's a new university recognized director of the Institute of Criminology, but there's also an old director in his old office. And so John's unique diplomatic skills are then applied to the business of coaxing Mike down the road to join the rest of us. Sorry, Graham, you're looking in there, yeah?
I think you're right. I think Mike was an excellent policing scholar, but I think he was eccentric in terms of managing things, you know. So
I mean, I think one of the things, I don't know, Shad, about you, because one of the things that we did during that period as we got into the 2000s is we were keen to recruit new talent. As we got into the 2000s. So during that juncture, we recruit yourself, we recruit Phil Scraton, we bring our colleague Ruth Jameson in, Graham Allison is appointed. So we're really building up the institute significantly. I mean, I don't know, Shad, if you wanted to come in and say what motivated you to come to this weird wee place, very far from your homeland.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the 1997 conference, which I was at, did play a big role in it. It was, it's one of those conferences. You have when you have annual conferences with these academic groups, they all start to blur together, and you start telling stories. Were we in Atlanta, or was that Chicago, or and these kind of things? No one did that with the Belfast '97 conference. I remember. Taking the ferry over from Liverpool, and then a bus up from Dublin to go to the meeting. And just as the bus, and we were crossing the border at the time, and then the burnt out cars started appearing on the sides of the road, and anyway, when we you quite quickly realized you weren't in Kansas anymore, and this was going to be an unusual criminology conference, and for many of us, and I meet people, now obviously I've been working here for 15 years or since 2005 or so, and people will say, "Oh, Belfast, yeah, I went to Belfast once, 1997." They remember exactly that criminology conference, and everyone had just a remarkable time at it. But it wasn't just the crack I would have come over for. It was a fascinating place to do criminology, to study crime and justice issues. I've often said, it is a kind of a criminologist, but a social scientist dream context in lots of ways, because these questions that we become kind of dry in academic textbooks about what is justice for, and what are the police for, and why do we have prisons, and these sort of things. They were all very much alive, and the 2005 Belfast. These were real questions that were being asked and re-asked and revisited, and it was palpable that there was an opportunity to be a part of those big discussions, and who's going to turn down that as a criminologist? It was too good to be true, for sure.
I think one of the things that we were very enthusiastic about everything, I think, and some projects probably worked more than others, but two that I can remember from the early days. One, myself and colleagues from the law school, John Morrison and Ray Geary, and we were involved working with Dave O'Mahony on a community crime survey. So, we adapted that, the different variants of that had been done elsewhere. And we brought in a guy who had worked on the Islington crime survey, a guy called Brian McLean, who's a very well-known critical criminologist. Brian was also an ex-prisoner. And but the thing I was never confident with quantitative data. Brian was super confident with quantitative data. And so his line to us would have been, basically, as a left-wing criminologist, you can make the numbers sing from a progressive point of view. And he was really working very hard to help us make the numbers sing. And so he would be writing stuff I would just be writing some qualitative analysis with Ray or John or Dave, and then just checking with Brian, are those numbers actually saying that? Like, for example, in the relationship between communities and estranged Republican working class communities and the police, because you kind of have a sense, well, we sort of think this, but then and he was very reassuring about that, about, numbers can't sing. As a left-wing critical criminologist, if you understand the data properly, the data will help you out. It will get you there. I remember as well, there's a colleague, a very distinguished drug scholar called Professor Karen McElrath, also an American who came over from the States as well. Karen and I did a big ethnographic study on the use of ecstasy in the club scene. So the club scene was emerging again in parallel with the peace process, and there was a lot of stuff at the time around, even in the English quality press, around this idea that basically ecstasy was going to resolve the Northern Ireland problem. You had these generations of clubbing young Catholics and Protestants who were hanging out together, and meeting, people from inverted commas the other side, and that this was going to be the center of the breakdown of years of sectarianism. And it's weird because I now have a daughter who's in her late teens, and she was asking me recently, she goes, Dad, in the club scene in when E was really big here, did you ever try it? Did you ever try E? It was the squarest answer I could imagine. So of course you want your daughter to think you're very hip and cool. And sorry, love, I have never tried E, and she's going, why not? Said, well, I was doing a study of it at the time, funded by the Northern Ireland office. And we were hanging out in all of these clubs. We were interviewing drug users. We were interviewing drug dealers. But my colleague and I made a deal very early on that, given that this was government-sponsored research, we wouldn't try it. So I kind of missed it because I was studying it. I missed 3 or 4 years of when that scene was at its height. And again, I was only in my late 20s, so possibly in another context would have been tempted to see what all this fuss was about. But instead, I was being a nerd, and I was writing about it, and I was hanging out in clubs, taking notes and writing up field notes afterwards, rather than the actual experience. But we were basically up for it. I think we were up for adapting, criminological stuff that was going on anywhere else, and then kind of suck it and see kind of approach. How relevant is this thing that's happening in policing elsewhere? There's lots of this really interesting ethnographic stuff being done on drugs in Manchester and other places. Is that relevant? Does that work for us? And, there's this thing being done on localized crime surveys. So basically, you were kind of up for it. Like it was, and as I say, sometimes it worked more effectively than others, but it certainly wasn't dull.
I'm going through some of my notes. We're talking about that next generation of criminologists that came 10 years or more after the founding in '95, and two interesting things I can see in here. One, I've got a little document of where we're talking about our successes, and this was the 2008 2009 era, and in that little window, we had won the book prize in criminology, British Criminology Society book prize. Twice in a row, we had Anne Marie McAlinden, who's now a professor in the law school, won it in 2008, and Louise Malander won it, likewise, a professor in law. Now, Louise and Anne Marie at the time were junior scholars. They won it back to back, 2008, 2009. Claire Dwyer at the same BSc conference won the Best Article Award, the Brian Williams Award for Article. Anna Erickson that year, 2009, was the New Scholar of the Year in Australia and New Zealand, one of Kieran's PhD students. So we had an injection of gender into the criminology conversation, and some really exciting and dynamic successes of young, at the time, new scholar, female scholars coming into the school. I also found the first ever meeting notes I went to in 2004. This was before I joined the school formally, but there was a half-day away day at the Malone Lodge Hotel on 8th of December 2004. I found the email, and yes, there's an interesting list of whether they all came or not, because I did come to the meeting. I sort of sat in the back, but there's a group of lawyers on here: John Stannard, John Morrison, Ray Geary, that we've mentioned. But there's also a number from the emerging sociology group of criminologists. So Patty Hilliard's name's on there, Karen McElrath, who we've already talked about, Mike Tomlinson's on there, and so we at some point, and this would be just as I've joined the school, the institute, although it was always housed in the School of Law, did broaden out to other schools, and my current School of Social Sciences in particular started playing a role in the flowering of criminology within the university as well.
I think it's a strong point actually, Shad, because despite the fact that we were the obvious risk for any criminology institute moving into a law school is that it will become overly legalistic and become legally technical, doctrinal, back letter law variant. And there is a place for that, obviously, within criminology, but it's only one place. And certainly I've seen in other contexts where that can become, where it can kind of drown out other imaginative work, you know. Actually, it was the opposite effect here. I think coming into the law school gave us the cultural capital that being in a law school brings, but allowed us to do fairly radical work, actually, you know. And it's interesting. So I've kind of, I suppose, moved away from criminology in the last 10 years or so towards what is called transitional justice, basically the how you do justice in post-conflict societies. But interestingly enough, I think you mentioned Louise Mallender there. Louise and I did a big project on amnesties, which we called Beyond Legalism, around about 2010, 11. Louise, now a very, very distinguished professor in the field. Kirsten Conakey also worked with myself and Harry Micah on this issue. And we were looking at that stage on transitional justice from below, basically a critique of different kinds of transitional justice. So in effect, in the area that I now work in, what happened was that um, that kind of critical legal studies, socio-legal tradition expressed itself through criminology, and the value added, if you like, for people who work in the transitional justice field now. If you think about what is the Queens do, it would be that Queens are always the people who are poking beyond legalism. They're always the ones who are saying there's a really interesting way of looking, for example, at amnesty. So in the way that Louise and I looked at amnesty, we were heavily influenced by the punishment and society folks, you know. So you know, the Richard Sparks type people, Jonathan Simon, David Garland, our thinking around amnesties came from that very strong criminological tradition within, Alessandro, your own area, you know, like people who think about the connection between punishment and society. And so I think that's always been a nice value added that we had as criminologists from this part of the world, albeit from the secure base of a law school. And it was the law school that gave us the security in order to do that kind of space, because people thought, well, if it's in a law school, it must be respectable enough, you know. So probably maybe your own work on sex offenders falls within, sorry, with sex workers, Graham, probably falls within that tradition as well, where you can do what in other contexts might be seen as slightly edgy work, but actually you're doing it in law school, so it's kind of, that must be fine, you know.
Yeah, I think there is a sense that, you know, working in a law school conveys a lot of legitimacy on what you're doing. It's got quite a lot of cultural capital as well. But yeah, I was just, you know, thinking that in my time as director, 2015 to 17, the first time, we did actually run, I think it was the first conference ever held on the island of Ireland on commercial sex. And incidentally, the university paid for half half of that. But we had like a lot of people came up from the Republic, over from England and Wales. We had a closed session that sex workers actually attended. But that was really, really good. And I think, you know, working in the law school conveyed a sense of legitimacy on that event that possibly meant it wasn't challenged as much as it might have been had it been held somewhere else, for example. But yeah, the other thing I was maybe going to say as well, and maybe like John, Shad, and Kieran could draw on it too, is that I was just thinking about working at Queen's compared to somewhere else, maybe, and what I've been finding here, or what I have found here, is that it's quite easy to access government departments and police and whatever. So I'm working on a project on sexual violence at the moment. At a meeting with PSNI on Friday, just a phone call away, basically. Whereas my counterpart in Scotland, she's had to go through all these hoops with Police Scotland and this, that, the other. Likewise, prosecutors, I made a call down to the PPS. Yeah, send us an email down about what you're doing, and we'll have a look and get back to you. So they actually got back to me the same day. So I think that's actually been invaluable, and I think it's something that we don't really acknowledge when we are doing the research. That ease of access. I don't know what your experience in England is, John or Shad. Would you've been in Rutgers, maybe?
Yeah, maybe I could just say a word there, because I think Graham's hit on something really quite important there that I found when I moved even down to Dublin and then across the water to England, that it was more difficult to make the kind of easy connections that you do make in a smaller jurisdiction. So, I mean, Graham, I think you mentioned, or someone was mentioning prosecutors. I mean, the fact of the matter is I'm kind of involved in a little bit of a project at the moment looking at sort of comparative ways in which prosecutors are coming into a new world and their relationships with the police, with Paul McGeehan, who's a kind of researcher in the north here, Northern Ireland. But we found one of the things was, we're looking at these different jurisdictions. One immediate thing was that, as soon as we approached Belfast, the DPP himself, the Director of Public Prosecutions, immediately sort of said, yes, I'll have you, you do something on Teams, because it was during COVID. But, he brought his whole sort of set of people, high level people, into a Teams meeting, lots of participation, so on. We didn't get that, needless to say, when we tried to approach the CPS in England. I mean, there's a very bureaucratic process there, which is, I feel it quite a lot here in Nottingham, whereby, and before the CPS were prepared to do any, that's the Crime Prosecution Service in England, before they're prepared really to get engaged in any research, you go through a lengthy bureaucratic process of permissions and so on. It's worse actually than getting permissions from the judiciary to interview, judges. So just complete contrast of culture and tone there, I think, in terms of the different jurisdictions. I mean, eventually we did manage to get a fairly high level CPS person to talk to us, but it wasn't really in the context of research. It was just really, we had to sort of spin it another way in terms of practice, very much sort of practice driven exercise rather than necessarily research. So that's definitely an experience that I would resonate with. Maybe just say one thing. I know Shad maybe wants to come in, but I'm just thinking Graham also hit there something I thought was quite important, just going back to the early days, but did move on, this idea of involving the Southern Ireland in criminology, because in a sense that I think there also things were, as in Northern Ireland, criminology was very slow, and the years whenever in England things were moving very strongly, and the British Society of Criminology was really lively. I mean, Ireland generally, north and south, were slow to engage, but I think I could say that, in a sense, bringing together, trying to sort of engage with the southern criminology communities. Belfast played a big role in that. We sort of had an annual North-South criminology conference. I know Graham was attended. He mentioned something that emerged later, but this goes back comparatively early. I mean, I kind of remember a long car journey with Shad and Kieran on the way back from Limerick, which is a god almighty place to go to if you're traveling by road. But we sort of made the effort to go all the way down, all the way back again. We remained in reasonably good terms, I think, at the end of it, but it was an ordeal. But it was something we enjoyed, nevertheless, when we got there, that, engaging with people in other law schools in Ireland.
Yeah, I remember that as well. But yes, the very first I've called up on my screen that none of you can see, of course, because this is a podcast. The very first North South meeting was held Wellington Park Hotel, 2005 September, and yeah, it's you. The letters from you, John, and Wen Li Zhang, our office supervisor at the time, and yes, this has become an annual, or mostly annual meeting. We've missed it in the occasional year thanks to COVID and other things, but it's been going strong for 15 years since that initial meeting we had in Belfast. And yeah, the turnout at that meeting, we hosted another one, and 6 years later with the University of Ulster, and Belfast. Again, to go back to your point, Graham, the turnout of people from the prison service, from police, from the judiciary, the senior civil servants at these events, and of course, we would have had an advisory board with representation from most of the different agencies, and as well as the Criminal Justice Inspectorate and NIACRO and other organizations, CRJI, Community Restorative Justice Ireland, and things were on our board during my years with the group. And so that meant when we would have these speakers like Jonathan Simon, Chris Eugen, Pat Carlin, Pat O'Malley, and others as our annual lecturer at the end, we would be exposing all the different agencies to these really thoughtful and critical criminological scholars. So it is a rare opportunity. You mentioned me going to New York, Graham. Yeah, there nothing like this. It would be, who are you? Never heard of you, and you take a number if you wanted to meet with anybody within the different criminal justice agencies, but certainly not the top people in the legal establishment in the country. So yeah, it makes this job, again, the issues are alive. Things like when I was I either just taken over or was about to take over when we had devolution of criminal justice powers in Northern Ireland. So these are big things. So the live issues that were happening, and then on top of that, you add that you're not the only show in town, but you're the biggest show in town in terms of a criminology, and so you're going to get this outstanding access. It makes for a potent mix for sure.
I remember you talking about the annual lecture there, Shad. I remember one particular annual lecture. You may remember it as well, John, where a former chair of our board, Judge David Smith, was chairing this event. And we had invited he wasn't long appointed, Sir Hugh Ward, as the chief constable of the PSNI coming in. This was before Sinn Féin went on the
I was
police.
there, yeah.
Were you there as well, Shad? Yeah. So anyway, Sir Hugh Ward is a pretty robust character, and so he's doing the annual lectures before Sinn Féin go on board. And at that stage, Ochre Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin youth, were protesting everywhere he went around issues which remain highly topical around collusion or you see involvement in human rights abuses and so forth. But clearly, a relationship had developed between Ord and the organisers of the thing, because one of them, I used to know, is a former Republican POW ex-prisoner, and so he was the organizer. He's the older guy organizing, and so basically he would go in. I'll not name him, but Hugh Ord comes in to do the lectures. A lot of security and stuff. There's a couple of hundred people there, and Hugh name checks him. He goes in. Hi, how are you doing? And he goes, Hugh, how are you? So it's like, this is the way this works. There's a protest, and then he gets on with the lecture kind of thing. But I remember there's a guy, they're holding up a protest. The young Sinn Féin are holding up the protest in front of Hugh Ward. And I think they've just got the timing wrong. I think the way the thing works is you hold up the protest around, it was around state collusion. And then eventually, obviously, you set it down and you either leave or you sit down and wait for the rest of the lecture. But I don't think somebody in the coordination hadn't passed the message on that at some stage you got to stop holding up the sign, because after a while that's a stress position, obviously, holding your hands out. So anyway, there was a young guy, I remember, sort of 5 or 6 of these young fellas holding up this thing. And the other thing that they didn't realize was that the thing where they had their message written on was actually translucent. And one of the young fellas who was holding up this thing about state collusion or whatever, very serious topic, needless to say, but he's holding this up, and obviously his testicles were itchy. And so he's holding it up with one hand, and he was reaching down behind the sign frequently to scratch. And all of us in the audience could see this. Ord couldn't realize, why is everybody laughing? Like, why am I being so funny? I'm doing this speech on my vision for the future of policing in the jurisdiction or whatever it was. And this very young fella, this young Republican, is scratching his testicles in view of the 200 people assembled in front of him. So anyway, eventually I think that the leader of Ogre Sinn Féin thought, okay, we've had our protest, let's get this down. And I think they sat through the rest of the lecture.
Yeah, I don't remember that particular incident, but I do
If you
remember
were there,
being a
you would
lecturer
remember.
and we were hearing about it, and we were hearing it was a very sort of civilized protest.
Totally similar, and like almost like part of the ritualized performance of this place. You know that the speaker arrives. There's security issues. There's an accommodation reached between protester and speaker. Everybody sort of gets on with it. Democracy, actually, and funnily, if you think about it now, what happens on university campuses, it was a very grown-up way of dealing with controversy. Actually, you let people have their protests, but you also let people exercise their right to free speech. And that's what happened. And okay, it was slightly interrupted by an itchy testicle, but nonetheless, democracy and freedom of speech were upheld. It's what universities are supposed to be about.
Thank you very much. We are approaching 45 minutes. So I think that now it's time to ask a question about the future direction. So where do you see criminology and criminal justice research and policy engagement at the ICCJ, on the island of Ireland and beyond after Brexit and nearly 24 years since the Good Friday Agreement going? Queens has become a powerhouse. I mean, we don't want to pat ourselves on the back too much, but beyond transitional justice now, we have developed a clear expertise on sexual offending, sexual work. Now we have members of staff who, starting out from the transitional justice context, have now become recognized experts in international criminal justice, transnational crime, environmental crimes in the international context, reintegration studies, and now we have an increasing number of people focusing on comparative criminal justice issues. So where do you see, again, in a post-Brexit world, in a increasingly globalized environment when it comes to criminological and criminal justice research, especially, again, now 24 years after the Good Friday Agreement, where do you see the research culture, the research environment, and engagements within the institute and the university moving forward?
I'm happy to kick off on that, and then if other folks want to row in. So, I mean, the obvious one post-Brexit, as you say, Alessandro, is the All Ireland conversation. That's the zeitgeist, the realities of the outworkings of Brexit. Obviously, the vast majority of people in this jurisdiction voted against Brexit, so it has been an issue that has been imposed on the jurisdiction against the will of people who live here. And that has led to an increased attention on All Ireland considerations more generally. Now, obviously, as we've chatted about already, people working here have always been involved in cross-border stuff, and I'm thinking not just the stuff we talked about already, but Professor Phil Scraton, one of our long-standing and distinguished colleagues now, Professor Emeritus. Phil's work on public order, on inquests, on family search for truth, that's applied across the water, not just to Hillsborough, but it's been picked up in Dublin, and it's been picked up in other parts of the South. And so there's always been that kind of work north-south. I think that's where the conversation's going. Interested, actually, John, to hear you're working on prosecutions issues around the Republic. We're seeing a lively debate at the moment about about police accountability and the investigation of complaints against the police in the Irish Republic. And obviously, a lot of the attention is drawing on the experience of the police ombudsman here. Shad, no doubt you could speak about prisons issues cross-border, certainly on the conflict-related transitional justice space and the issues of legacy. Myself, my colleagues Louise Mallender and Anna Bryson, also members of the Institute, we have been looking a lot on the north-south aspects of that, what if anything, and there are certain roles that the criminal justice system in the Republic need to play in order to meet the needs of people affected by the conflict. So what I think for me, the obvious big thing in terms of research in this jurisdiction is about research in this jurisdiction and the Republic, and what that all island criminological conversation looks like. I think that's quite an exciting area, and obviously it's building on a significant amount of work that's already been done. But for me, that's one obvious direction of travel for us all.
Yeah, I think for me, Kieran's obviously right. I think an All Ireland dimension is something that's probably inevitable that we will have to focus on. But for me, I think it's a combination of old issues and new issues. My historical interest has been in policing, and in many ways, the PSNI have done some quite good things, and in other areas there is sort of room for improvement. But I remember, I think it was about 2003, maybe 2004. I had a drink with David Bailey, a very famous American policing scholar, and he said, "Well, you have to remember it's going to take 20 years." And I said, "What is?" He said, "Oh, the transition from RUC to PSNI." So really, we're sort of sitting around 17 years at the moment, and I'd say we're probably only about 65, 70% there. So I think there is scope maybe to sort of look at what's happening in terms of newer issues, things that have been mentioned, particularly around Me Too, sexual consent. I think that's becoming an absolutely huge topic. And I think that's really the reason why the PPS and the police are actually engaging with us on this project anyway, because it is so topical. But I'm not sure if this necessarily sits with criminology or where you'd put it, but I- I'm kind of interested in how young loyalists think and feel, but I'm not sure how to get at that, because that they seem to be, people talk about the left behinders, and that does really seem to me to be a kind of a category of person that has been left behind, certainly around in terms of the debates about peace and so on and so forth, that I think young nationalists have been much better able to mobilize and to kind of own the peace process. But I'm not sure how I could link that to some kind of research area. But that's just my random thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Graham. And in my world, prisons world, we had a less gold-plated version of the Patent Commission, the OER's review of the prison service, much later, even than 17 years ago. So that's only going back now. I've lost it in my head, but 7 or 8 years since the OER's review. But yes, we are starting to see very belatedly a real change away from what the prisons were in the 1990s, when I first started coming over here, and this, like the police, was a service very, very badly in need of reimagining, and so we're starting to see some of that, and yes, we're gonna continue to see change here. I mean, this is the gift of Brexit in some ways, is that it has reinvigorated some of the tensions on the island, and created some new tensions as well, and has sped along the process that we're talking about, this that's soon going to be coming in terms of the constitutional status here on the island. And other issues that are surely going to come up. We mentioned green criminology, the environmental criminology is certainly going to become all the more urgent in the future. The issues around protest and the right to protest, and the kind of fine line between protest and rioting. You're starting to see all over, from the January 6th Commission work in the United States to issues around the policing of Sarah Everard protests, or the Black Lives Matter protests, even here in Belfast, where we had COVID rules being used to police those protests. I think we're decades ahead of the curve when it comes to that kind of behavior, both on the policing side and the citizen side in Northern Ireland. And so there's an enormous amount the world could learn from the way we deal with protest, riot, and all the gray area in between there, here, all sorts of issues, and that global local that you mentioned early, Alessandro, I think we've always, it's certainly since my time here, have been globe trotting. I know Graham and Kieran are certainly always overseas, but at the same time, drawing on the expertise locally and bringing back the expertise globally and the international research we do. I think we're well placed to continue doing that kind of thing into the
I would just endorse all the things that people have said. I think in terms of maybe Northern Ireland being an exemplar, Kieran mentioned the Public Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland in some ways is a bit of a gold standard because of the way it was set up over time. It was kind of evaluated in great detail. It was inspected, and it's kind of looking across at other jurisdictions. It's a good exemplar, I think, of the way to go, and particularly in the south, where they're thinking there now of having a kind of public prosecution service for all offences. But as well, to pick up maybe on what Graham was saying in terms of sexual offences, I think the role of how they're handled in the courts obviously is been very significant, with the Gillen Review coming up with, I think, 250 recommendations, which no one thought that would really happen. But those recommendations are, again, a kind of exemplar that we're able to come out of a small jurisdiction, but are definitely now getting sort of international attention. And it's really a way in which, how can a small jurisdiction maybe do things that others can't so easily? And, we obviously, Northern Ireland has low rate convictions like other jurisdictions as well. But there is a kind of exemplar there in terms of how to deal with it on an interagency basis. And I know at the moment there's research. I think Dr. Dowd in the Criminology Centre in Belfast is actually at the moment sort of in a placement arrangement with the Department of Justice, looking at this whole issue, which again is I think is going to lead to very interesting issues relating to consent and how those are managed in the courts. And I suppose just there also thinking of COVID, the way in which technology is kind of perhaps acting as a catalyst for these kinds of cases where you pre-record lots of stuff before the trial, and the whole idea of people having to sort of humiliate themselves in a sense, or be humiliated in court with sort of questioning that goes on, can be sort of handled in a different way, perhaps through technology and COVID. So there's downsides to this sort of digital revolution that's going on in the courts, but there may be some upsides to it as well, which may come out in some of the research.
I would like to thank our distinguished guest today for an exceptionally interesting conversation reflecting on the past, present, and future of criminology and criminal justice research at the ICCJ here at Queen's University Belfast. Thank you so much to our listeners, and stay tuned for more podcasts in the ICCJ series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessandro.